talk to John Clarke, but we haven't turned his headphones on yet, or his microphone, so I can have a bit of a chat to you, the listener. Before we do so, now, I've been talking to Clarke on the program for yonks. Over 1997 was the first, and then in December 2003, we've talked about all sorts of things. His, nice, soft, puffy interviews, things like his debut appearance in Barry Mackenzie, his cultural affinities with John Betjeman, W.A. Jordan, all sorts of stuff, but no more Mr. Nice Guy. I am going to rip into him tonight. No, he's got no idea what's coming up, but, I think it's time he's confronted with his shortcomings instead of this endless adulation for his alleged genius. Now, this is my issue. There's a new book out. It's called The Catastrophe Continues, 21 years of interviews, and it's Clarke and Dawe on the front here. And it's got the texts of so many of the interviews that have gone on to the 7:30 report with Hawkey, Bajelke, Peterson, Thatcher, Peacock, Johns Elliott, Hewson, Button, David Hill, Alan Bond, etc., etc., Bronwyn Bishop, hundreds of them, Philip Ruddock, Kevin Rudd. But I don't know if you've noticed, but he makes no effort. They're all the same. They are all bloody well identical. Does he wear prosthetic noses? No, he doesn't. Does he whack a wig on? Not the slightest effort, and I don't think we're getting our money's worth, our 6 cents a day. So I'm going to sink the slipper. Good evening, John. How are you?
Hang on, I'm just trying to put these headphones on. Philip, sorry, where were you?
I'm just saying, good evening, John. How are you?
Good evening. You're well?
Not terribly. What about
Excellent.
you?
You mentioned value for money. Can I require a further and better definition of money?
John, why is it that you don't try when you're doing these interviews? Why don't you lift your game a bit and create a variety of theatrical characters? Why is it that you just sit there for 21 years being you?
The ABC, as well you know, Philip, used to have a deeply enriched wardrobe department, but they've shut it and they've taken the frock to Sydney. So there's very little we can do. We make do with what we can. It's a minimalist exercise by virtue of necessity.
I remember you were always a bit uneasy about dressing up. You fled from New Zealand, really, because you became super famous after your Fred Dagg thing. And even when you were doing the Gillies report, God, that's ages and ages ago, during the Hawke government, there's the star, the other star, going to no end of trouble to give vocal and physical facsimiles of Hawke or Diamond Jim McClelland, and you just sit there on the screen doing nothing. Now, you started to put wigs on. Do you remember that? You started...
I did. I started to put wigs on because I was balding and I was actually presenting a lighting problem. So I said, I'm going to put a wig on, but not for reasons of vanity. So I'll consent to do it if and only if I can put a bigger one on each week and it will become the program's plot.
And you finished up looking like Bronwyn Bishop, didn't you?
I did, yes, an idea that she seized from me.
I must admit...
But that, of course, was one of the reasons that program was such a creative success and a wonderful program to work on, was precisely the mixture of various different things and various different elements. That was a pretty remarkable group of people, that.
Yes, I loved every minute of it. I sent you an email a couple of weeks ago, actually, saying thank you, because I happened upon, on cable, a complete replay of the games.
Oh, yes.
And I just sat there and was paralytic. Wonderful, wonderful thing. That was
that was a terrific project to work on. That was a wonderful collaboration, and that was nice because you could pretend that you weren't trying to be funny by pretending to be dramatic inside a documentary.
Yeah, I've just suddenly realised I emphasise this. There is one character that you did present in the 21 years of interviews that for whom you created an uncanny, visual thing, and that was Peter Garrett.
Yes, that's right. Well, Peter and I have often been mistaken for one another because of our gifts.
I was thinking more of your baldness.
Oh, I'd never noticed that, but I must pay more attention. I'll have a look at Peter when I see him.
How did you pitch this idea 21 years ago to the ABC?
Well, television wanted me to do something that was sort of satirical and inside a current affairs program, and I would do anything at that stage rather than do a monologue, because I'd done a lot of monologues. I'd done oodles of them in New Zealand and oodles of them here, principally on radio, which were wonderful, but I was trying to think of ways of getting another voice in, so that I noticed that instinctively I was taking a lot of phone calls inside the monologues, and I was talking to the panel operator inside the monologues and things. So I was desperately trying to get an idea that would involve another voice. And so I thought, well, I tried doing these interviews, and I actually tried them in a newspaper column I had in a now-deceased newspaper called The Times on Sunday, where I tried the idea out. And then when I was asked to do some monologues on television, I said, how about I do monologues but with someone else? And they said, technically speaking, that's not exactly what we mean. And I said, I beg your pardon, and have a look at this. Let's have a go at a bit. And when we first did them on television, we did them on Channel 9, and Jana Wendt was the host, and she got it. And she very intelligently realised that it is an unusual idea. It's a bit surreal. And so her rule was that she didn't want to be shown anything we did until it went to air live. And it was a very sensible decision and an extremely helpful one to us.
I'm fascinated at the way comic duos loathe each other, Flanagan and Allen, Lewis and Martin, Abbott and Costello, even Gilbert and Sullivan. And of course the same thing applies to you and your collaborator.
Yeah, Bryan, we can't stand each other.
Do you ever talk off camera?
We barely speak. We have this sort of white knuckle arrangement every week where we professionally have to deal with one another, but the sooner we get out of it, the happier we are.
What is it about you he finds particularly loathsome, do you think?
I think it's probably that he resents being told what to do. He resents any kind of command system. He's essentially an anarchist. And I order him round a bit, and I think that, perhaps not unnaturally, it gives him the squirts.
We're giving him right of reply. He's coming on later.
I'll leave. I'm not having anything to do with him.
We're not suggesting he should be in the same studio or even in the same city. We've made other arrangements.
I've got a contractual problem otherwise.
I always loved This Day Tonight because it pioneered irreverence in public affairs television, and sadly, you two are the only elements of irreverence that really survived in the 7:30 report. It seems to me that your time has come. I mean, after the program, I'll go home and I'll look at the Daily Show with John and John Stewart and the Colbert Report, and marvel at them. And yet Australians were into this a long time before the Americans. We really did fiddle with all forms of political irreverence, didn't we?
We did, and it's interesting because it did happen in current affairs shows. It did in New Zealand too, whereas in Britain and America they encouraged a lot of comedy shows, and they encouraged them rather intelligently, and they team built. They put people together, like Monty Python's not a group of people who worked together before they were Monty Python. They were two groups. In fact, they were three groups. They were put together by Barry Took at the BBC. We don't have a fostering program, so a lot of the humour here, and the satirical humour particularly, has perhaps found its home because of its association with journalism rather than because of its association with comedy, because, television's idea of comedy was not always the idea that people wanted to write. I mean, there were some appalling sitcoms in the 70s and 80s and things, and you'd get asked to write them, but you'd think, no, we're not going to do that.
Well, John, we have caught up big time with Chaser and working dog stuff, but it still seems to me that the two American shows, Colbert and Stewart, are genuinely quite profound works of political analysis. The TiVo editing that Stewart uses to open every night's program, really, where he'll contrast the various, paradoxes or nonsenses or contradictions, rather, in public statements by a George Bush or a McCain or indeed an Obama, are revelatory. And yet whole thing, you piss yourself laughing at the same time.
That's right. And they're also interesting because they in conventional American network context, you'd have to have gone for a much broader demographic, whereas they can go for a very savvy, intelligent and knowledgeable subsection of the American audience and A, get it, and B, get its international equivalent simultaneously online. Those Tina Fey Bing Palin interviews, for example, 80% of the people who've seen them did not see them on television.
Well, his rating, if you look at Stewart's, the actual audience for the show, last time I looked, they go up every time there's a presidential election. The actual audience is about 1.5 million.
Yeah.
But the flow-on impact from those two programs is simply, well, it's beyond calculation.
Yes, that's right.
Why don't you do one?
Yeah, well, on the online stuff is very significant in those shows. Well, it would be good to do that. I think that they have got there are quite a lot of writing. The writing is the key to a lot of these things, and you need excellent writers, and they've got squadrons of them, and obviously they're replaceable because the names don't always stay the same. Tina Fey, for example, when she's being Sarah Palin, wouldn't have a problem if she forgot what she was about to say because she's a writer. She'd just make something up and it'd be good. The writing.
Well, in her case, of course, she doesn't need to make anything up. She tends
she doesn't. She
recycle Palin.
To remember what Palin said yesterday. Exactly. That's an interesting point because I think that a lot of Australia's humour has come out of a non-fiction rather than a fiction base.
Have you been, this bit, this won't go to air, this bit, have you been approached recently? He lied smoothly.
I couldn't have guessed.
No one's asked you to do one?
Do what?
To do a Palin, to do a Stewart type program.
Oh, do a show like that?
Yeah.
Well, not exactly. There are proposals all the time floating around for various ideas, and of course that also has the advantage in terms of cost of being a studio-based sort of desk program. And so it will appeal to a lot of people. But I wouldn't want to do a show that was sort of based on that. I'd rather do a show that was an original idea. And
God forbid that you should. It's just that the times they are changing and they're heading in that direction.
They are. And I think that, if you look at the history of humour, there's an enormous amount of humour in the 30s when times were very tough and the model had fallen over, and maybe we're headed for that.
Yeah. And of course you did create a new genre, although I'm not sure that others would make this connection. I think the Games was indispensable in a sense to The Office.
Well, perhaps, but we're all working in a tradition, and there are things before the Games that are, you could see some provenance in perhaps Yes Minister or something, and in perhaps radio. There's a river of things happening. I agree that you can see things in the programs that followed that owe some debt to small discoveries we made, or indeed to where the industry was up to at the time, because the industry changes all the time. The medium that you're on in television is a constantly changing one, and for example, if you did the Games now, you'd have quite a lot of onlinery attached to it. You'd be releasing stuff online that would not be supposed to have been released online, and talking about it in the program and all sorts of other things. You couldn't do that at that time.
I complain about your lack of prosthetic noses and wigs when you're doing the interviews, but when you're in fact discovering that almost every great poet was born in Australia, you go to no end of trouble to create a local version thereof. Let's just listen to this. This fella seems to bear some relationship to a Welsh fellow called Dylan Thomas.
One Christmas was so like another in those years around the Seatown corner now, that I can never remember whether it was 106 degrees in 1953 or whether it was 103 degrees in 1956. All the Christmases roll into one down the wave-roaring, salt-squinting years of yesterboy. My hand goes into the fridge of imperishable memory, and out come salads and sunburn lotions, and the brief exuberant hiss of beer being opened, and the laugh of wet-haired youths around a Zephyr 6. the smell of insect repellent and eucalyptus and the distant, constant, slowly listless bang of the flywire door, and resting on a formica altar, waiting for Ron, the biggest pav in the world, a magic pav, a cut-and-come-again pav for all the children in all the towns across the wide, brown, bee-humming, trout-fit, sheep-rich, two-horse country. And the aunts, always the aunts, in the kitchen on the black and white photographed beach of the past, playing out the rope to a shared childhood, caught in the undertow and drifting. And some numerous uncles, wondering occasionally why they want each other, coming around the letterbox to an attacking field in the test match and being driven handsomely by some middle-order nephew, skipping down the vowel-flattening pitch and putting the ball into the tent flaps on the first bounce of puberty.
That's a wonderful piece of work. Where did you discover this particular poet?
Well, he came from the south coast of Victoria, somewhere in between Port Fairy and Portland, and that particular piece is called The Child's Christmas in Warrnambool. I imagine that his family used to go to Warrnambool for its Christmas holidays. And
down to the fishing boat bobbing sea, probably.
Down to the fishing boat, yes, indeed. The black,
slow black crow, black fishing boat, etc.
Exactly. Well, I grew up sort of listening to that, and I thought, what a wonderful... You know, the question in any creative endeavour is not so much form, not so much content as form. You need to know what it is that you're going to do. You can have an idea, but is it an idea for a television show or for a movie or for an article in the paper? Or I had quite a good one the other day for a phone call to my sister. So I made it, and it went very well. But you have to understand the form, and I was so delighted when I discovered how brilliantly the great poets have basically worked out their own form in each case. They all work, or else they wouldn't be who they are. And his is fantastic because it's partly narrative and it's partly to do with sort of stacking adjectives in a pile along the railway line of the story.
Yes. Oh dear. Coming back to you and your appearance on television and film, I remember when you came to Australia, you were fleeing from the extraordinary and painful celebrity that Fred Dawe forced on you in New Zealand, and for a while you sort of hid. You absolutely didn't want to be seen, and yet in a strange way, ever since, by going on telly as you, whether it's in the games or whether it's in the 21 years of catastrophic encounters, you don't have a carapace. There's nowhere to hide. I find this a bit of a dilemma.
Yeah, well, how do you think I feel? I've got no idea quite how to deconstruct this. I mean, the idea that I was going away from celebrity is your idea, and it's a very generous-spirited one. And I've often wondered whether I just was doing. There's a system whereby if you want to do anything in some creative enterprise, you have to get yourself into the position where it's possible to do, and then you do it, and you do it as well as you can. But by the time you're in a position to do it, you've got another idea, and you're actually doing something you wanted to do 18 months ago. And Fred Dawe was an idea that I'd wanted to do when I was at university, but it was illegal to be on television when I was at university, and I had to wait for the life's Ferris wheel to do a couple of circuits before I was allowed to do it. Then by the time it happened, I had a wonderful time doing it, but my creative mind wasn't working on that anymore. It was ahead a bit. I didn't know quite what it was doing, but it wasn't going to be happy just doing that. So I don't know quite what that was all about psychologically looking back, but I do find the business of saying that you are someone and not pretending to be that person and undeniably being yourself, and what does that mean? I think that's pretty funny. That's Beckett.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's to do with a whole lot of things.
You and that other bloke that sit on the telly, you're Vladimir and Estragon in a sense.
Well, perhaps we are, and perhaps we all are. I'm not making a claim that I've got some insight into Beckett or the same insights that Beckett has. Obviously, that's a ridiculous thing to claim. But I am saying that the observations that lots of people make are similar when they observe the same sorts of things. Beckett and lots of other people, Magritte, for example, observes people who are undoubtedly in the right clothing, and they're sort of going about their business in a conventional way, but they are facing the wrong way and they're in the sky, or they're looking at the back of their own head in a mirror or something. There's something a wee bit skew-whiff, and we recognise that it's a bit skew-whiff because lots of things are.
John, you're wonderfully skew-whiff, and I thank you for it. And please give my best to your collaborator.
I shall do that, although he can't stand you and he'll probably hit me.
I know, but you didn't have to tell the listener that. I'm going to end by playing a little bit of one of your impersonations. This one is of Senator Bob Collins, who was at the time Minister for Shipping. It's called The Front Fell Off, and while we enjoy it, John, you can take your leave and hide somewhere.
Thank you very much, Philip.
Oh, John, how I miss him, and I know we all do. 3 years since we lost this remarkable human being.